Pulled from deep earth, polished smooth by hands that had held power for generations. Obsidian, black as the void between stars, sharp enough to split a molecule. 300 Elysian nobles watched in absolute
confirmed!
silence.
We must act!
Okay.
The evidence is clear. We
The
cannot
ceremonial
delay.
hall stretched before him like a cathedral carved from ice and
I can make
starlight.
fence, not
Tall
fall
crystalline
wrongs.
pillars rose
The
50
twenty
feet
protects
overhead,
like
refracting
that
the light
gives
of
me
twin
wing-wing.
suns into fractured rainbows that danced across walls smooth as glass. Everything here was designed to make a human feel small, insignificant, temporary. It was working. But Kael had learned something in the 3 months he'd spent drifting alone through dead space rationing oxygen waiting for a rescue that never came. When you've already lost everything, fear becomes an abstract concept, something that happens to other people who still had something left to lose. High Marshal Corvus held the blade steady. His face was inches from Kael's, close enough that Kael could see the subtle patterns in his skin, pale blue fading to silver at the edges like frost forming on morning glass. The Elysians were tall, 7 feet on average, with features that were almost human but refined, sharper, as if evolution had filed away every unnecessary curve and left only elegant angles behind. "You dare petition for sanctuary!" Corvus hissed his voice low and measured, "when your species cannot even hold a single colony world." The words hung in the crystalline air. Kael kept his eyes forward, fixed on the empty throne at the far end of the hall. Massive, carved from a single piece of blue-white crystal that seemed to generate its own light from within. No one sat there. The throne had been empty when he'd entered. Empty for 11 years, according to the whispers he'd heard in the lower levels while waiting for his audience. "With respect, Marshal," Kael said quietly, his voice steady despite the blade's pressure. "We held Nova Prime for 6 years against the Dominion. We only lost it because no one answered our distress calls." A murmur rippled through the assembly like wind through tall grass. Corvus's grip on the blade tightened. The edge drew a thin line of blood. Kael didn't move. Pain was relative. He'd survived the fall of Nova Prime. He'd watched the orbital bombardment from the viewport of the last evacuation transport, helpless as the agricultural domes burst into flames. Alara had been in Dome 7 coordinating the evacuation of the eastern sectors. The communication link had stayed open until the very end. "I love you. Keep them safe." Those were her last words. Then static, then nothing. 3 months alone in a damaged escape pod. The oxygen recycler working at 60% capacity. The distress beacon powered by a failing battery. Every morning wondering if this would be the day his air ran out. Every night dreaming of fire and Alara's voice cutting to silence. Death didn't scare him anymore. Nothing did. "Insolence," Corvus said. "Truth," Kael replied. The blade pressed deeper. Blood ran warm down his neck, soaking into the collar of his salvaged flight suit, the only clothes he owned. Everything else had burned with Nova Prime. His home. His wife. His entire life reduced to ash and vacuum. Corvus leaned closer. His eyes were silver, without pupils reflecting Kael's face back at him. "Your kind are refugees. Beggars. You have no fleet, no resources, no leverage. You are worth less than the air you breathe in this chamber." Kael met those silver eyes without blinking. "I didn't demand sanctuary, Marshal. I asked. There's a difference." The silence that followed was absolute. 300 nobles held their breath, waiting. The tension stretched like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with potential energy. One word, one movement, one decision that would snap it. "Enough!" The voice cut through the hall like, a winter wind given form. Every Elysian in the chamber dropped to one knee instantly. A wave of motion perfectly synchronized as if choreographed. Corvus released the blade and descended his forehead, nearly touching the polished floor. Kael remained standing. Not out of defiance. He simply didn't know what else to do. No one had explained the protocols. No one had taught him how to kneel before alien royalty. And frankly, after 3 months alone in the dark, after watching his world burn, after losing the only person who'd ever mattered, he was too exhausted to care about ceremony. Queen Lyris descended from a side passage he hadn't noticed. She moved like something between a dancer and a predator, each step deliberate, controlled. Her pale blue skin seemed to generate its own luminescence under the crystal lights as if she were lit from within by cold fire. She wore ceremonial robes that trailed behind her like liquid shadow, the fabric so black it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, but it wasn't her height that made Kael's breath catch. It was her presence. She carried authority the way some people carried scars visible, undeniable, earned through pain. Her features were angular and sharp, her silver eyes cold as polished steel. Her hair, if you could call it that, was more like fine crystalline strands that moved independently, responding to some invisible current in the air. She stopped 3 paces from Kael and studied him with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition, no mercy. "You are bleeding on my floor, human." Her voice was quiet, precise. each word measured and deliberate like a surgeon selecting the right instrument before making an incision. "Apologies, Your Majesty," Kael said. "I didn't bring the blade." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps. Or irritation. It was hard to read alien expressions, especially when those faces were designed by evolution to reveal nothing. The nobles remained frozen foreheads, pressed to crystal floor and not daring to look up. "You do not kneel," she observed. It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. Kael considered several responses, chose the honest one. "I don't know how your people kneel, Your Majesty. I'd rather stand and show respect than kneel and show ignorance." The silence stretched between them like a bridge made of glass, fragile, transparent. One wrong step and it would shatter. Then Lyris turned to Corvus, still prostrate on the ground. "Rise, Commander. Explain why you've drawn blood in my hall without my permission." Corvus stood, his skin flushing darker, a purple undertone bleeding through the pale blue. Anger, maybe, or embarrassment. "The human demanded sanctuary, my queen," Corvus said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "He has nothing to offer. No fleet, no resources, no political connections. He is worthless." "I didn't demand," Kael said, keeping his eyes on the queen. "I asked. There's a difference." Lyris's gaze returned to him. Those silver eyes seemed to look through him rather than at him, as if she could see past skin and bone to whatever was left of his soul. "And what would you offer for sanctuary, human?" Her head tilted slightly. "What do you have?" Kael considered the question. What did he have? His ship was scrap metal, good only for recycling. His people were scattered refugees across a dozen systems, too busy surviving to worry about diplomacy. His wife was ash. Her atoms dispersed across the atmosphere of a dead world. His homeworld Earth was 3 generations of faster-than-light travel away, and had made it very clear they wanted nothing to do with the colonies. He had nothing. Less than nothing. But he'd come this far, survived this long, and he'd be damned if he'd lie now. "Labor," he said finally. "I can work. I'm an engineer. I can fix things." Laughter erupted from the nobles. Low, cruel, dismissive. The sound echoed off crystal walls multiplying surrounding him. Corvus smiled, showing too many teeth, another difference between humans and Elysians. They had more teeth than they needed, all perfectly straight, all sharp. "We have machines for labor, human," Corvus said. "We have engineers born to castes higher than your entire species. You have nothing we need." Kael felt something settle in his chest, a familiar weight. He had carried it since Alara died, since Nova Prime burned. It was acceptance, he supposed, or resignation. The knowledge that some battles couldn't be won through skill or determination, some battles you lost before they began. "Then I have nothing," Kael said. His voice didn't shake. "But I'm asking anyway." The laughter stopped. Something in his tone, maybe, or the simple honesty of admitting defeat while still standing upright. Whatever it was, the nobles fell silent, waiting. Lyris raised one hand. The gesture was small, almost casual, but the effect was immediate. Every sound ceased. Every movement stilled. The Queen's word was absolute law here, Kael realized. Not enforced through fear or violence, but through something deeper. Habit, tradition, the weight of centuries. "Leave us," she said. Corvus's eyes widened. "My Queen protocol demands, leave us." The command left no room for argument, no space for negotiation. It was as absolute as vacuum, as final as death. The nobles filed out in rigid formation, their movements stiff with barely suppressed shock. Corvus lingered, his silver eyes, promising violence when they met again, but he obeyed. The last to leave his gaze, never leaving Kael until the great doors sealed behind him with a sound like a tomb closing. Kael was alone with the Queen. The silence was different now, heavier, more intimate. The massive chamber suddenly felt smaller, the distance between them more significant. Kael could hear his own heartbeat steady and slow. Could hear the faint hum of whatever power source fed the crystal lights overhead. Lyris circled him slowly, studying him from every angle. He stood still, letting her look. There was nothing to hide, nothing left to protect. He was a human in salvaged clothes, bleeding from a ceremonial wound, standing in an alien palace, light years from anything that resembled home. "You are not afraid," she said, finally stopping in front of him. Close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her skin, like frost forming on glass, constantly shifting, never quite the same from one moment to the next. "No," Kael said. "Why, I've already lost everything, Your Majesty. Fear requires something left to lose." She was silent for a long moment, those silver eyes searching his face for something. Lies, maybe? Or weakness? Or whatever it was that queens looked for in petitioners. "My advisors will demand I execute you for the insult you've shown today," she said quietly. "Probably. You're not going to apologize for what? Telling the truth standing when I didn't know to kneel bleeding on your floor?" He shook his head. "I'll apologize for genuine offenses, but I won't apologize for existing." Lyris was silent for another long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, and yet it carried through the empty hall with perfect clarity. "I'm coming to your room tonight." Kael's heart stopped. What? You will be given quarters in the eastern wing, basic accommodations." She paused, and for the first time something like uncertainty crossed her features. "Tonight, after the third moon rises, I will come to you. We will speak privately." Her expression gave nothing away now. The uncertainty was gone, locked behind walls of control that seemed impenetrable. "Tell no one," she continued. "If you do, I will deny it, and you will be executed for slander against the crown. Do you understand?" Kael's mind raced. This was either an interrogation, an assassination, or something stranger. None of the options seemed particularly good. "Why?" he managed. Laris turned away her robe, sweeping across the blood-stained floor where Kael had stood beneath Corvus's blade. "Because you are the first person in 11 years to stand in my presence and speak without calculating advantage." She moved toward the throne, her back to him now. "Do not mistake this for the affection, human. I am curious. Nothing more." The doors opened. Guards entered, their crystalline armor catching the light, transforming them into walking prisms. As Kael was led from the hall, he caught one last glimpse of the queen standing alone before her empty throne. Just for a moment. Just long enough to see her posture shift, the rigid control slipping for a fraction of a second. And in that fraction, Kael recognized something he'd seen in his own reflection for the past 3 months. Loneliness. The kind that hollowed you out from the inside. The kind that made you do things that didn't make sense. The kind that whispered in the dark hours that anything, even talking to an alien refugee with nothing to offer, was better than another day of perfect, terrible isolation. The guards led him through corridors of crystalline light, past chambers filled with technology he didn't understand, through halls where other Elysians stopped and stared at the human being escorted through their pristine palace like a specimen in a zoo. They brought him to the eastern wing. The quarters were sparse. A bed, a table, a window overlooking an alien garden. The garden was filled with plants that looked like they were made of crystal, their branches catching the light and refracting it into sound, a low constant hum like distant wind chimes. The door sealed behind him. Kael sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, from exhaustion. From the sudden weight of surviving another day when part of him had expected, maybe even hoped, that the blade would go deeper. He'd asked for sanctuary because he had nowhere else to go, because drifting through space in a dead ship seemed like dying slowly, and he'd wanted to choose how his story ended. The Elysians had a reputation for being logical, efficient, and merciless. It seemed like a good place to find resolution one way or another. But now? The third moon was rising. He could see it through the window, smaller than the other two, pale blue against the purple sky. The crystal plants sang their strange song. Somewhere in the palace, a queen he didn't understand was preparing to visit a human who'd bled on her floor and refused to kneel. Kael didn't know what would happen when she arrived. Interrogation, assassination, something stranger. He was too tired to care. He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling where the light from the crystal garden played in shifting patterns. Alara would have loved this place, he thought. She'd always been fascinated by alien cultures, by the way different species solved the same problems in completely different ways. She'd have filled notebooks with observations, sketched the architecture, tried to decode the social structures. But Alara was gone. And Kael was here alone, waiting for a queen to visit his room for reasons he couldn't begin to understand. The third moon climbed higher. The crystal garden sang its eternal song. And Kael waited, suspended between past grief and uncertain future, too exhausted to hope and too stubborn to surrender. Outside his window, the twin suns set beneath the horizon, and the palace lights brightened to compensate, turning the crystalline structure into a beacon, visible for miles. The eastern wing, where the cursed queen lived in isolation, where no noble dared to visit, where tradition and superstition kept an entire section of the palace empty, except for one woman who ruled an empire from a throne she couldn't trust. Kael closed his eyes. Whatever came next, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything since Nova Prime burned, with nothing left to lose and a nowhere left to run. The waiting was the hardest part. The third moon rose. Kael watched it climb through the window, pale blue light washing her across the crystal garden below. The plants sang louder now, responding to the lunar pull, like terrestrial tides responding to Earth's moon, except here the singing was literal. A crystalline chorus that vibrated through the palace walls, a frequency just at the edge of human hearing. He'd been staring at the ceiling for 2 hours. Sleep wouldn't come. Hadn't come easily since Nova Prime. His mind kept replaying the day, the blade at his throat. Corvus's silver eyes promising death, the queen's unexpected declaration. "I'm coming to your room tonight." The words looped in his thoughts like a damaged recording. A section of the wall slid open. No warning, no sound. Just a seamless panel retracting to reveal a passage Kael hadn't known existed. The walls here weren't walls at all, he realized. They were modular, reconfigurable, honeycombed with secret corridors and hidden routes. Queen Laris stepped through. She was alone. No guards, no attendants, no ceremonial robes trailing behind her like shadows. She wore simpler clothing now, still elegant, still clearly royal, but practical. Without the ceremonial weight, she looked smaller, more real, less like a statue carved from ice and more like a person who happened to be 7 feet tall. "You're actually here," Kyle said, sitting up. "You doubted me." I considered the possibility this was an elaborate test, to see if I'd try to escape. The corner of her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. "And if it were—" "Then I'd fail," Kale said, standing, "because I have nowhere to go." She moved to the window, looking out at the crystal garden. In the moonlight, the plants seemed to glow from within their song, filling the spaces between heartbeats. Lyra stood perfectly still, her reflection ghosting in the glass, a pale figure caught between two worlds. "How did your wife die?" The question hit him like a blade to the chest, different from Corvus's blade, sharper, more personal. Kale took a breath, steadying himself against the familiar weight of grief. "When the Dominion broke through our orbital defense, they didn't invade, they just burned everything from orbit." He stared at his hands, remembering how they'd trembled on the transport controls. Alara was in the agricultural sector coordinating evacuations. I was in the engine room of the last transport trying to keep it running long enough to break atmosphere. The words came easier than he'd expected. Maybe because Lyris was a stranger. Maybe because she'd asked without pretense or pity. "I got out," he said quietly. "She didn't." "Do you blame yourself?" "Every day." Lyris turned from the window. "Among my people, survivors of great loss are considered cursed, touched by ending. To associate with them is to invite misfortune." Kel absorbed this. "So I'm bad luck on top of being worthless. According to tradition, yes. And you're here anyway." She sat in the single chair, studying him with those silver eyes that reflected light without revealing anything beneath the surface. "My consort died 11 years ago." Her voice was flat, practiced, as if she'd recited these words so many times they'd lost all meaning. "Since then I am considered cursed. The nobles tolerate me because I am competent, and the succession is complex. But no one touches me. No one stands close. No one speaks to me without calculation." "Until me," Kale said. "Until you, a human with nothing to lose who doesn't know our superstitions." She paused. "It is novel." Kale considered this, pieces sliding into place. "So you're not curious about humans. You're curious about anyone who will actually talk to you." "Perhaps." Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. The first uncontrolled gesture he'd seen from her. "You are perceptive." "I'm an engineer. We troubleshoot, find root causes." He met her eyes. "You're lonely, Your Majesty." "Queens are not lonely. Queens are isolated by necessity and design." "That's not a denial." The silence stretched. Outside the crystal garden sang its endless song. Inside, two survivors of different catastrophes sat in the pale light of 3 moons, circling around truths neither wanted to speak aloud. "My people believe emotional expression is weakness," Lyris said finally. "That control is virtue. I've been controlled my entire life. Perfectly composed, perfectly appropriate." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I am exhausted human, more tired than I knew it was possible to be." Kyle stood slowly, walked to the window giving her space. Below, the crystal plants swayed in a wind he couldn't feel. "On the transport when we were escaping Nova Prime, there was a moment when the engines failed. We were falling back toward the atmosphere. Everyone was screaming." He touched the glass, cool against his palm. "I remember thinking how strange it was that after everything, the siege, the bombardment, losing Alara, what finally scared me was the silence when the engines cut out. Not the dying, the quiet before it." "What happened?" Lyris asked. "I fixed the engines, barely. We made it to orbit with about 30 seconds of fuel left." He turned back to her. "My point is I understand tired. I understand being so exhausted that dying seems simpler than continuing. But I also understand that sometimes you fix the engine anyway because there are people depending on you." Lyris was quiet for a long time. "You did not fix the engine for yourself." "No, for the 47 people in the cargo hold." "And now what keeps you functioning now?" Kale thought about it. Chose honesty. "Nothing. I've been going through motions waiting for something to give me a reason." He shrugged. "Maybe that's why I asked for sanctuary here. Maybe I was hoping your people would give me purpose, or kill me. Either way, resolution." "That is deeply sad." "It's honest." Lyris stood. She walked toward him, stopping an arm's length away. This close he could see that her eyes had flecks of something darker in the silver, like distant stars viewed through atmospheric haze. "The nobles will not accept you. Corvus will push for your execution. You have perhaps 3 days before the council convenes to decide your fate." She paused. "I could intervene." Grant you protection under the crown, it would cost me politically. They would see it as weakness, sentiment, a cursed queen protecting a cursed human. Then don't, Kael said. I'm not worth a political crisis. Her voice sharpened. That is for me to decide, not you. Do not make the mistake of valuing yourself through their eyes, human. The intensity surprised him, made him see something beneath the controlled surface, something fierce. You asked for sanctuary without leverage, she continued. Stood without kneeling, bled without flinching. Among my people those would be considered acts of profound stupidity, but I am beginning to wonder if they are something else. What courage, or perhaps integrity? She moved past him toward the hidden door. Tomorrow you will be summoned to serve in the engineering caste as a provisional laborer. It is beneath your skills, but it will keep you alive while I determine what to do with you. Thank you. She paused at the threshold. Do not thank me yet, Kyle Ashford. I have not decided if you are useful or merely interesting. The difference matters considerably to your survival. The door slid closed behind her. Kyle sat back on the bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened. A queen had visited his room. Shared her loneliness, offered him temporary protection. For the first time in months, he felt something other than emptiness. He wasn't sure what to call it, but it felt dangerously close to hope. The engineering caste worked in the lowest levels of the palace complex, where the great machines that powered the Elysian capital hummed in eternal rhythm. Kale was assigned to maintenance, cleaning filtration systems, replacing worn components, carrying tools for the actual engineers Elysians born into technical castes, raised from childhood to understand the systems that kept their civilization running. It was degrading work. It was exhausting. It was exactly what he'd asked for. The other workers ignored him, not with hostility, just the complete indifference reserved for furniture, for background noise, for things beneath notice. Kale found he didn't mind. 2 weeks passed. He learned the rhythms of the palace, the unspoken hierarchies, the way information flowed through the caste system like water through carefully designed channels. He learned which supervisors were fair and which were cruel, which sections were well maintained and which were held together by improvisation and luck, and he learned that the Queen's systems were failing. It started with small observations, a pressure valve showing wear patterns inconsistent with its supposed replacement schedule, temperature fluctuations in the environmental controls, power regulation in the eastern wing, Lyris's wing reading unstable on diagnostic panels that everyone else walked past without noticing, minor issues, barely noticeable unless you were looking. But Kyle had seen this pattern before. On Nova Prime, in the months before the infrastructure collapse that had weakened their defenses enough for the Dominion to break through, small failures compounding, systems degrading at rates that suggested deliberate neglect rather than natural wear. He filed a report through the proper channels. It disappeared into the bureaucratic void. He filed another. Same result. On the third report, a young Elysian engineer approached him during a break. She was shorter than most of her species, only 6.5 feet, with skin that showed more purple undertones than the typical pale blue. Her eyes were curious rather than dismissive. You're the human, she said, not a question. Kael. Vera. She glanced around, making sure they weren't observed. Your reports about the eastern wing systems, they're being buried. I noticed. Do you know why? Kyle set down the filtration component he'd been cleaning. I have theories. The degradation pattern you identified is real. I've been tracking it for 6 months. Vera pulled up a data tablet showing him graphs and diagnostic readings. The systems have been failing gradually for years, but every official inspection comes back clean, acceptable operational parameters. She zoomed in on a specific timeline. The degradation started long ago, more than 11 years, and Kale felt something cold settle in his chest. Who oversees the engineering inspection committee? He asked, though he already suspected the answer. High Marshal Corvus? Of course. If someone wanted the Queen's systems to fail, Kale said slowly, thinking it through, they'd need access to maintenance logs, authority to falsify inspections, and time. Years of it. To make it look like natural degradation, Vera finished. Not sabotage, just age and oversight. They stared at each other, both understanding the implications. This is treason, Vera whispered. This is attempted murder, Kale corrected. Long-term, carefully planned murder. He studied the data more closely. The timeline was damning, but something about it nagged at him. The pattern started more than 11 years ago, before the Queen became cursed, before her isolation would have served any political purpose. Why start sabotaging systems before there was a reason to want her dead? Unless, Vera, he said slowly, what happened to the Queen's consort? Exactly how did he die? She hesitated. Official records say plague, a rapid neurological condition that swept through some of the noble houses 11 years ago. But only a handful died, And they all died in their private quarters. No spread, no containment protocols. It was... She trailed off. Strange, Kale's mind raced. Environmental systems in private quarters. Degradation that started before deaths occurred. A conspiracy that predated the Queen's isolation. The original target might not have been Lyris at all. So, the fourth week, Kyle broke protocol. The Queen's private crystal garden was forbidden to all but her personal staff, but the hidden passages Lyris had used to visit his quarters connected to maintenance corridors Kale had access to. He'd mapped them during his repairs, noting how the palace was designed with parallel systems, public routes, and secret ones. He found her among the singing crystals. She sat on a bench, carved from the same blue-white material as her throne, still wearing formal robes from some ceremony. In the light of 3 moons, she looked exhausted, the perfect control slipping just enough to show the weight she carried. You should not be here, she said without turning. The power regulation in your wing is failing, Kale said, walking closer. I've filed reports. They're being ignored. Now she turned. You risked execution to tell me about engineering problems. I risked execution because someone's deliberately bearing the reports, and that means someone wants your systems to fail. He pulled out the data tablet Vera had given him. That's not an engineering problem. That's a threat. Lyris was silent for a long moment, studying the graphs and diagnostic readings with the kind of focus that suggested she understood exactly what she was seeing. Corvus controls the Engineering Oversight Committee, she said quietly. I know. You're suggesting he's trying to kill me. I'm suggesting the evidence points that direction. What you do with it is above my pay grade. She touched one of the degraded components he'd highlighted in the data, her expression unreadable in the crystalline light. If I accuse him without proof, he'll claim I'm paranoid, cursed, unfit to rule. She pulled her hand back. If I do nothing, eventually something will fail catastrophically. There's a third option, Kale said. Fix it quietly. Document everything. Build a case. I can do the repairs myself off schedule. No one notices maintenance workers. By the time Corvus realizes the sabotage isn't working, you'll have evidence of what he was trying to do. That would take weeks. I'm not going anywhere. Lyris studied him. You would do this for a queen who has offered you only provisional survival. I'd do it because it's the right thing to do. He paused. And because you talk to me like a person, not a piece of furniture. That's worth something. Among my people, it would be worth nothing. Good thing I'm not your people. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. Recognition of a kindred stubbornness, a refusal to accept the world as given. She reached out, touched his hand, brief, feather light, barely contact at all. But among a people who believed touch transferred curse and fortune alike, who had kept her untouched for 11 years, who had weaponized isolation into political control, it was profound. Begin the repairs, she said softly. I will ensure you have access through the maintenance corridors. Document everything you find. We'll need irrefutable proof. Chill. She turned and walked away through the crystal garden, leaving Kael alone with the sound of singing plants and the echo of her touch on his skin. For the first time since Alara died, he felt something beyond grief and exhaustion. Purpose. A reason to fix the engine. A reason to keep functioning. Not for himself, never for himself, but for someone who'd been alone even longer than he had. Someone who'd been surrounded by people and still felt the crushing weight of isolation. Someone who'd touched him despite everything her culture demanded. Someone worth saving. The next 2 weeks became a rhythm of careful deception. Days Kael worked his assigned duties, cleaning, carrying, the invisible labor no one questioned or remembered. He made sure supervisors saw him exactly where he was supposed to be doing exactly what was expected. Nights belonged to different work. Through the hidden passages, routes only he and Lyris knew existed. Kael moved through the palace's skeleton. The spaces between walls where conduits ran and power flowed, where the real infrastructure lived away from the polished crystal surfaces the nobles saw. He worked in silence, no lights except what his repair tools provided, moving only when he was certain the maintenance schedules showed the sections empty. To Corvus's oversight committee reviewing their perfunctory monitoring logs, Kael was just another maintenance worker doing his assigned tasks in public areas. They didn't know about the hidden passages. They didn't know about the documentation building in shadow. Each night, Kael cataloged failures, photographed degraded components, cross-referenced actual conditions against official inspection records. The evidence accumulated like sediment, layer after layer, building towards something irrefutable. Vera helped when she could, accessing restricted databases during legitimate work, downloading historical maintenance schedules, creating a timeline that stretched back more than 11 years. And Lyris came to the Crystal Garden when the third moon rose. Never announced, never scheduled, just appearing like a ghost among the singing plants, still wearing whatever formal mask the day had required, peeling it away slowly in the moonlight. They talked. About the evidence Kael was building. about the political calculations Lyris was making, about the careful game they were playing, appearing to ignore each other in public while building a case in private. But they also talked about other things. Nova Prime and the colony it had tried to build, the marriage Lyris had endured to a consort she'd barely known, the weight of duty and the cost of survival. The conversations were never long, an hour at most, but they carved spaces in Kael's chest where grief had lived alone for months. New rooms, different purposes. He found himself looking forward to those meetings with an intensity that both comforted and frightened him. "You're good at this," Lyris said one night, reviewing his documentation on her private tablet. "The evidence is comprehensive." "I'm an engineer. We think in systems." Kael sat on the bench beside her, closer than protocol allowed, close enough to feel the subtle temperature difference her skin generated, cooler than human, but not cold. "The question isn't whether Corvus did it. The question is why he started so long ago." "Patience," Lyris suggested, waiting for the right moment. "Maybe." Kael studied the timeline again, that nagging feeling returning. "But why start before your consort died, before isolating you would serve any purpose?" Lyris went very still. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not sure yet, but the pattern bothers me. It's like..." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "It's like someone started sabotaging infrastructure for one purpose, then adapted the plan when circumstances changed. You think there was an original target?" "I think the evidence suggests it, but I don't have enough data yet." Lyris stood pacing among the crystal plants. Their song changed pitch, responding to her agitation. Theron died in his private quarters. They said plague, but the symptoms were unusual. Rapid onset. No spread to others in close contact. Consistent with what? Hypoxia was one theory. Oxygen deprivation. But the environmental systems showed no failures in official reports. Kael and Lyris locked eyes. "The same conclusion forming. We need to see those original reports," Kael said. "The ones from 11 years ago. They'll be sealed, confidential. Can you access them?" "As Queen, technically, yes. But accessing sealed records of my consort's death would raise questions, especially if Corvus has people monitoring such requests." Kael thought for a moment. "Then we don't request them officially. Vera has access to engineering archives. If she's careful, you're asking her to commit treason for a theory. I'm asking her to find truth. What she does with it is her choice." Lyris was quiet for a long time, staring out at the crystal garden. Finally she nodded. 3 more days. 3 more days of documentation, and we should have enough to present to the Council, with or without the historical records." 3 more days, Kael echoed. She turned back to him. In the moonlight, her silver eyes reflected something that might have been hope. Or fear, or both. "If this works," she said quietly, "if we expose Corvus and survive the political fallout, then what?" "Then I don't know," she stepped closer. "You'll have earned your sanctuary, your citizenship if you want it. You could stay or leave, build a new life. And you, I'll still be queen, still bound by duty and tradition, even if we break some of those traditions." Kael understood what she wasn't saying. The pull between them was real, but even if they survived the conspiracy, even if they exposed Corvus and reformed the system, there were limits to what a queen could do, lines she couldn't cross without destroying the very authority they were fighting to preserve. "One problem at a time," Kael said, standing. "First we survive, then we figure out what comes after." Lyris reached out again, touched his hand less briefly this time. Her skin cool against his, her touch gentle despite everything. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, for believing I was worth saving." "You saved yourself," Kael replied. "I just helped you see the evidence." She smiled then, a real smile, small but genuine, the first he'd seen from her. Then she was gone, disappearing through the hidden passages, leaving Kael alone in the crystal garden with 3 more days to build a case and hope it was enough. But they didn't get 3 days. The next evening, during the second shift, when half the palace slept and the other half was occupied with routine, the crisis came. Kael was deep in the Eastern Wing's infrastructure, replacing a critical power regulator he'd identified as near failure when the alarm started, not the maintenance alerts he'd grown used to. These were emergency protocols, evacuation signals, the kind of alarms that meant something catastrophic had failed. He ran toward the sound tools still in hand. The secondary power grid, a system completely separate from the ones he'd been secretly repairing, had failed during an emergency council session, the throne chamber, where the entire noble assembly was gathered. Kael arrived to chaos. Smoke screaming, guards dragging injured nobles from the chamber, emergency lighting casting everything in harsh red, and bodies, 7 of them. Elysians caught too close to the power surge when the grid failed, dead. Corvus emerged from the smoke, his face a mask of controlled fury. But beneath the anger, Kael saw something else. Calculation. Satisfaction. This wasn't an accident. This was the plan. "Find who did this," Corvus commanded the guards. Search every maintenance corridor, every access point, find... He stopped. Saw Kael standing there with tools in his hands. Emergency access code still active on his work tablet, grime from the infrastructure work still on his clothes. Their eyes met. Corvus smiled. Him, the High Marshal said, pointing, and the human. He's been in restricted areas for weeks. Unauthorized repairs, unsupervised access. His voice carried across the chaos clear and authoritative. Arrest him! Kael understood immediately. Let Kael discover the sabotage. Let him start repairs in the Eastern Wing. Let him get comfortable with access to restricted systems, establish a pattern of working in places he shouldn't be. Then trigger a catastrophic failure in a completely different grid one Kael hadn't touched, she couldn't have known about, and frame him for it. The perfect scapegoat. The cursed human who'd corrupted the cursed queen. Guards seized him. Crystalline armor digging into his arms. His tools clattered to the floor. The work tablet with his access codes was torn from his hands, but not the data crystal he'd hidden in his boot 2 days ago. The one containing copies of all his documentation given to Vera for safekeeping in case something exactly like this happened. Wait, Kael started. I didn't... Pain exploded across his face. One of the guards had struck him. Blood filled his mouth. He spat it onto the polished floor. Red on crystal. Just like the first day. They dragged him to the throne chamber. Through the smoke and emergency lighting. Past the bodies of nobles who'd died because Corvus needed a crisis dramatic enough to justify execution without trial. Through halls where other Elysians watched with horror and vindication, the cursed human had finally proven the curse was real. The chamber was packed. Every surviving noble. Every caste leader. Everyone who mattered in the Elysian hierarchy summoned by emergency protocols the moment the grid had failed. Corvus had timed it perfectly. Maximum attendance. Maximum witnesses. Maximum political impact. Lyra sat on her throne surrounded by advisors and guards. Her face was a mask of perfect control, but Kael could see the tension in her shoulders. The way her hands gripped the armrest just slightly too tight. She'd known this was coming. Maybe not the exact timing, maybe not the precise method. But she'd known Corvus would eventually force a confrontation. Kael was thrown to his knees before her. Chains materialized ceremonial restraints, the same kind that had been used for executions for 1,000 years. They locked around his wrists with a sound like breaking ice. Blood dripped from his split lip onto the crystal floor, the same floor he'd bled on 4 weeks ago. Full circle. Corvus stood at the prosecution position, his skin flushed with the purple undertone of righteous anger. He'd positioned himself perfectly between Kael and the throne, between the accused and the queen, the protector standing between danger and the crown. The human has been found in restricted areas of the palace, Corvus announced to the assembly, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed chamber. He has tampered with critical systems without authorization. He has conducted unsupervised repairs in locations as he had no clearance to access. Sheg, he gestured to the bodies being carried from the chamber. And 7 of our people are dead because of his incompetence. 7 nobles who served this empire faithfully killed by a human who thought he understood systems beyond his primitive comprehension. Gasps rippled through the assembly. Murmurs of shock and anger. Hostile looks directed at Kael at the human who'd been allowed into their palace, given access to their infrastructure trusted despite the curse. I accuse him of sabotage, Corvus continued, of criminal negligence resulting in death, of treason against the crown and the empire. He turned to face Lyris directly. And I accuse Her Majesty of complicity, of allowing her judgment to be clouded by association with a cursed human, of endangering this council through sentiment and weakness, of failing in her duty to protect this assembly from threats she should have recognized. The chamber erupted. Nobles shouting, accusations flying back and forth. The careful political order Corvus had maintained for 11 years fracturing in exactly the way he'd planned chaos. He could shape fear, he could direct crisis, he could resolve by taking control. Kael looked up at Lyris through the blood running into his eyes. Her silver gaze met his, and in that moment he saw the calculation happening behind her perfect mask, the choice being forced upon her, save him and lose political capital, admit her judgment had been compromised, confirm every whisper about the curse taking her mind, watch her authority crumble, or let him die, preserve her position, sacrifice one human refugee to maintain the fragile balance of power, live to fight another day from a throne she could still claim. It shouldn't have been a difficult choice. One life versus an empire. Kael wouldn't have blamed her if she'd chosen the empire. It was the logical decision, the smart decision. The decision any competent ruler would make. He prepared himself for that choice. For the moment she would condemn him to preserve herself, for death at the hands of people who'd already decided he was cursed. But then something unexpected happened. The chamber doors opened. Vera entered, her purple-tinted skin flushed darker with fear or determination or both. She carried a data crystal that caught the emergency lighting and transformed it into a rainbow of refracted fire. The crystal Kael had given her for safekeeping, the evidence they'd compiled together, the documentation he'd hidden away precisely because he'd known Corvus would eventually make a move like this. "I have evidence," Vera said, her voice cutting through the chaos, young, uncertain, but carrying. "Evidence that will prove the human's innocence, and prove something far worse." Every eye in the chamber turned to her. A young engineer, barely past her cast training, interrupting an emergency council session, speaking without being acknowledged, challenging a high marshal's accusation. It was unprecedented, potentially suicidal. But her hands were steady as she approached the throne, and her eyes never left Lyriss's face. "Show me," Lyris commanded. Vera inserted the crystal into the chamber's main display system. Holographic screens materialized in the air above the assembly, visible from every angle. Data streams. Maintenance logs, diagnostic readings, photographs of components showing years of deliberate degradation, all time-stamped, all verified, all cross-referenced against official records, all irrefutable. "This is documentation compiled by Kyle Ashford over the past 2 weeks," Vera said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "It shows systematic sabotage of palace infrastructure spanning more than 11 years. Every falsified inspection, every buried report. Every instance where critical systems were allowed to degrade beyond safe operational parameters while official records claimed they were functioning normally." The nobles stared at the data, struggling to process what they were seeing, the scope of it, the duration, the implications. "The pattern is clear." Vera continued, highlighting specific timelines on the display. Deliberate sabotage disguised as natural wear, maintenance reports falsified to hide ongoing degradation, and all of it overseen by a single committee with the authority to bury evidence and silence concerns. She zoomed in on the organizational chart. The Engineering Oversight Committee, chaired by High Marshal Corvus for the past 15 years. Murmurs grew louder, nobles conferring with each other, looking between the data and Corvus with new suspicion. "But here's what's most damning," Vera said, her voice cutting through the noise. "The secondary grid that failed tonight, the one that killed 7 nobles, was not part of K.L. Ashford's repairs. He never accessed it, never knew it existed. It was part of the original sabotage triggered remotely during this session." She pulled up technical schematics showing the grid's design and the remote activation protocols. The human couldn't have caused this failure. He didn't have the clearance, the knowledge, or the access. But someone else did. Someone who designed the sabotage years ago and has been waiting for the right moment to trigger it. Vera turned to face Corvus directly, and Kael saw something remarkable in her expression. Not fear anymore. Anger. Righteous fury at injustice witnessed and evidence uncovered. "The sabotage began 11 years and 2 months ago," she said. 1 month before Consort Theron died. Complete silence. You could have heard a crystal crack in the sudden stillness. "I accessed sealed records from that period," Vera continued. "Records that should have been destroyed but were preserved in technical archives. Environmental system failures in the royal quarters, oxygen regulation malfunctions, hypoxia symptoms consistent with equipment failure." She brought up medical reports, system diagnostics, investigation findings, all stamped sealed, but now displayed for the entire assembly to see. "Consort Theron didn't die of plague," Vera said, her voice steady and clear. "He died because someone sabotaged the environmental controls in his quarters. Someone who then used his death to create the curse mythology. Someone who isolated Queen Lyris for 11 years while continuing to sabotage systems, waiting for the right moment to trigger a crisis that would allow him to seize power." She locked eyes with Corvus. "Someone who murdered the consort, killed 7 nobles tonight, and is trying to frame an innocent human for crimes he himself committed." The silence was absolute. Crushing. 300 Elysians frozen in shock, trying to reconcile what they'd believed for 11 years with what the evidence was showing them now. Corvus's carefully controlled expression finally cracked. His skin flushed deep purple, his silver eyes wide with something between rage and panic. "This is absurd," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. "The word of a junior engineer and a human criminal against documented evidence." Lyris stood. Her voice was quiet, precise, lethal. She descended from the throne, each step deliberate, each word chosen with surgical precision. The perfect control she'd maintained for 11 years, now weaponized, transformed from defensive armor into offensive blade. "I have reviewed every file K.L. Ashford compiled," she said, moving through the assembly toward where Corvus stood. "Every cross-reference, every chain of evidence. I've verified the data against multiple independent sources. It is thorough, accurate, comprehensive." She stopped in the center of the chamber, surrounded by nobles' guards and the smoke still lingering from the explosion that had killed 7 of her people. "And it is damning." The word fell like a hammer. "It shows a pattern of deliberate sabotage beginning more than 11 years ago, before my consort died, before I became cursed, before there was any political benefit to destroying palace infrastructure. It shows falsified inspections under your committee's direct oversight. It shows a systematic effort spanning more than a decade to create conditions where deaths would appear accidental, where systems would fail at convenient moments, where a weak queen could be replaced by a strong military protector. She turned to face the assembly. You murdered my consort! The accusation hung in the crystalline air. You sabotaged environmental systems in his quarters and let him suffocate over the course of hours. You created the plague story to avoid investigation. You manufactured the curse mythology to isolate me, to make me powerless, to position yourself as the only competent authority in a failing system. Her voice grew stronger. You spent 11 years systematically destroying palace infrastructure, waiting, planning, and tonight you triggered a catastrophic failure that killed 7 nobles, loyal members of this council, to frame a human who was actually trying to save lives, who discovered your conspiracy and built evidence against you. She stopped directly in front of Corvus. You murdered my husband. You killed 7 nobles tonight. And you've spent 11 years manipulating this entire empire through fear and manufactured crisis. Corvus's control shattered completely. To save the empire from weakness, he shouted. From a queen who couldn't rule effectively, from sentiment and compromise, from what? Lyris cut him off. From a ruler you couldn't control, from a government that didn't put military power above all else, from a society that might value something other than strength and domination. She turned back to the assembly. There is no curse. There never was. Only grief and isolation and the calculated cruelty of those who use fear to justify control, who weaponize superstition to maintain power, who murder the innocent and call it necessity. The nobles stared at her, some in shock, some in slowly dawning understanding, some in horror at how thoroughly they'd been deceived. This human saw what you tried to hide. Lyris continued, looking at Kael, still chained on the floor. He risked his life to protect mine, not because I commanded it, not because he sought reward, but because... She paused, and for the first time let real emotion show in her voice, because he believed it was right, because he has more integrity in his smallest action than this council has shown in 11 years, because when everyone else saw a cursed queen not worth saving, he saw a person worth protecting. She turned back to Corvus. High Marshal Corvus, you are stripped of rank and title. You will be confined pending full investigation. And when that investigation confirms what we already know, and it will, because the evidence is irrefutable, you will face execution for treason, conspiracy, and the murder of Consort Theron and 7 members of this council. Guards moved forward, different guards than the ones who'd arrested Kael. Personal guard loyal to the throne rather than the military command. They seized Corvus, who struggled against them, his composure completely gone. You doom this empire. He screamed as they dragged him toward the chamber doors. You elevate aliens over your own people. The curse has taken you. You are unfit to rule. This will destroy everything. But the guards were already pulling him from the chamber, his screams echoing off crystal walls until the great doors sealed behind him with finality. Lyris walked to where Kael knelt. The chamber fell silent again, watching, waiting to see what she would do. How she would handle this human who'd exposed a conspiracy, but also violated protocols, who'd saved her life, but also challenged traditions. Release him, Lyris commanded. The chains fell away with a sound like breaking glass. Kael stood slowly, every muscle aching, blood still dripping from where the guard had struck him. He swayed slightly dizzy from adrenaline and relief and the sudden weight of surviving when he'd been certain he wouldn't. Lyris reached up, touched his face, gently, deliberately, with infinite care, in full view of the assembled court, in full violation of every tradition that had kept her isolated for 11 years. The nobles stared in shock, some in horror, some in scandal, but others, younger ones, mostly the ones who'd never fully believed the curse mythology, with something that might have been approval, or hope. You saved me, Lyris said quietly so only Kael could hear. Again. I just showed you what was there, Kael replied. You saved yourself. Perhaps. Her hand remained on his cheek, her skin cool against his, her touch gentle, despite everything they'd just survived. Perhaps that's what I needed. Someone to show me I was worth saving. Around them the council erupted in arguments, nobles demanding investigations, advisors scrambling to understand the new political reality, guards escorting shocked assembly members. The careful order Corvus had maintained for 11 years, fracturing and reforming into something new. But in the center of it all, a cursed queen and a grieving human stood together, touching, present, refusing to hide. This will cause problems, Kael murmured. They'll say I corrupted you, that the curse is real, that you're not fit to rule. Some will, Lyris agreed. Others will see a queen who refused to die quietly, who found an ally in an unexpected place, who chose connection over isolation, who valued truth over comfortable lies. And what do you see? Kael asked. She lowered her hand but didn't step away. I see a beginning. I see someone I would like to stand beside. Not as servant or subject, but as... She hesitated, uncertainty crossing her features. I don't know the word yet. Partner, perhaps. Ally. Someone who sees me as I am. We'll figure it out. Kael said. Together. Together, Lyris echoed. Around them the Empire churned. Arguments about succession and authority, questions about Corvus's co-conspirators, demands for reforms and investigations, the weight of traditions being challenged and power structures being questioned. The future hung uncertain, fraught with complications and challenges neither of them could fully predict. But for the first time in 11 years, Lyris wasn't alone. And for Kael, for the first time since Alara died, he had a reason to keep fixing things, to keep functioning, to keep choosing life over the easier silence of giving up. They stood together in the chaos, two survivors finding unexpected purpose in each other's company, and let the uncertain future come. It was enough. It was a beginning. 4 weeks later, Kael Ashford became the first human granted Elysian citizenship. The ceremony was smaller than traditional installations, just the Reformed Council and a handful of witnesses. No grand spectacle, no crowds. Just a quiet acknowledgement of something unprecedented. Queen Laris herself conducted the oath, her voice steady as she recited words that had never been spoken to a non-Elysian before. When it was done, when Kael had sworn his loyalty to an empire that had almost killed him, when the crystal seal was placed in his hand, marking him as a citizen of a world light years from Earth, Laris dismissed the council and led him through hidden passages to the Crystal Garden, their garden now, the place where everything had changed. The third moon was rising, casting blue light across the singing plants, the same light that had illuminated their first real conversation, the same song that had accompanied every secret meeting. They stood at the edge of the garden, looking out over the capital city spread below, lights from thousands of crystalline structures turning the night into a constellation brought down to ground level. Corvus's co-conspirators are being investigated, Lyris said. 3 nobles, 2 military commanders, a network that runs deeper than we initially thought. It'll take time to root out, Kael observed. Yes, years probably. The reforms we've started questioning traditions, restructuring oversight, opening investigation into past deaths, they're meeting resistance. Not everyone believes the curse was manufactured. Not everyone trusts that change is necessary. But some do. Some do, she agreed. Enough to begin. Enough to build on. She turned to face him. You could leave, you know. Your citizenship is real. You could take a ship to any Elysian world. Start fresh somewhere without the complications of the capital, without the political scrutiny, without you, Kael finished. Without me, she confirmed quietly. Kael was silent for a moment, considering. He could leave. Start over somewhere his past wasn't written in blood and conspiracy. Find work as an engineer. Build a quiet life far from throne rooms and political intrigue. But that life would be missing something essential. I spent 3 months alone in the dark, he said finally. Drifting. Waiting to die. And even before that, after Alara was gone, I was alone even when I was surrounded by people. Isolated by grief, by trauma, by the weight of surviving when I didn't want to. He met her silver eyes. I'm not alone anymore. I'm not isolated. And I'm not leaving the person who helped me remember what it feels like to be alive. Something shifted in Lyris's expression. Hope, perhaps, or relief, or the careful beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. We're not a simple story, she warned. I'm a queen with an empire to reform. You're a human in a society that still doesn't fully trust your species. We'll face opposition, scandal, complications that don't resolve neatly. I'm an engineer, Kael said. I specialize in complicated systems, and the best solutions are rarely simple. The corner of her mouth quirked, almost a smile. They stood close together, not quite touching, watching the city lights and the rising moons. 2 people who'd been alone too long, learning how to exist in proximity without armor, without walls. What do we do now? Lyris asked. We fix what's broken, Kael said. We build what's needed. We figure it out one day at a time. Together. Together. The crystal plants sang their eternal chorus. The third moon climbed higher, and 2 survivors, a queen who'd refused to die quietly, and a refugee who'd refused to give up, stood in their garden and watched the stars. Not touching, not quite, but present. And that was enough. It was a beginning.